We're going to be looking at a tooth next. We're going to begin with a mature tooth anatomy. We'll look at a drawing of that. Then we'll look at a series of drawings showing what's going on with tooth development, how the tooth forms and kind of embryonically its developmental origins. Then we'll look at the composition of enamel, dentin, and cementum of the tooth, those three materials, compare their composition in the tooth. Then we'll talk about the periodontal ligament and then tooth pulp. So we'll look at all of those things to describe what you need to know about a tooth. I've drawn a tooth here on the board, and we'll just kind of quickly go over the parts, then we'll go through and label everything. This represents the gum line right here outlined in the red coloration. This is bone down here that's cross-hatched in this brown color down here. The middle, of course, is your pulp cavity. Outlined in blue, we have our dentin layer, a layer of dentin material, and the enamel is on the outside, of course, outlined here in brown. Between the dentin and the pulp cavity on the inside, I have these black markings that represent the odontoblasts, the cells that lay down the dentin on the inside of the tooth. And between the dentin layer and the bone right here, we have a couple of layers. The first green layer we have here is cementum material. It's very similar to dentin. And then outside of that, we have a special kind of collagen that attaches the tooth to the bone. It's a connective tissue material, and we call it a periodontal ligament, the periodontal ligament. So let's go through and label these things now. First of all, on the outside, we have the enamel. Then in the blue outline, we have the dentin material. Then in the black spots here, we have what we call odontoblasts. And in the center there, we have the tooth pulp. Oh, let's see, we've mentioned this is your epithelium over your gum line there. So this is gum epithelium. It's a stratified squamous epithelium of your oral cavity. Beneath that there's some connective tissue, and then under that there's bone. Let's see, we need to label the green zone right here. That's our cementum. And then outside of that is our periodontal ligament. So those are the primary components, anatomical components of an adult tooth. Now this section of the tooth that extends above the gum line right here, this is sometimes referred to as a clinical crown, and that part that extends from the top of the tooth down below the gum line to the bottom of the enamel, that's sometimes referred to as an anatomical crown. So we have a clinical crown, and an anatomical crown. Down below the gum line, where we get into the bone, that attachment to the bone, all this down here we consider the root of the tooth. So this section here is the root. The section between the root and where the clinical crown begins, this section right here is sometimes referred to as the neck. So crown, neck, and root of the tooth. One more item I'll make mention of here on the anatomy of the tooth. I forgot to mention this earlier. This opening into the pulp cavity, this is where nerves and blood vessels would have their access to the tooth pulp to help keep the tooth alive. So that's going to be an important part of the structure So there's kind of an opening here where things can go up into the pulp. This is referred to as an apical foramen. The apical foramen. During embryonic development, when your teeth are first starting to form, they begin at specific points along the jawline, the developing jawline, under the epithelium. There develops from that epithelial layer a place where the cells begin an ingrowth, a downgrowth into the underlying connective tissue along the jawline. Your bone of your jaw would be eventually in here. Now there's an upper jaw and a lower jaw, of course, but it's kind of the reverse on the upper jaw as it would be on the lower jaw. So if this is lower jaw, that would be the surface epithelium of the lower jaw, and from that, a little downgrowth begins right there. And we're going to refer to that as the tooth bud. It's the very beginning of the tooth. A little bit later from that tooth bud, if we're looking at it a little more magnified here, that tooth bud grows down and forms this upside down cup shape with a little attachment structure coming off the side of it there. And this is the beginning of what we call an enamel organ. The enamel organ is going to form the enamel layer of the tooth. So it begins with this structure from the tooth bud up here and then forming this enamel organ here. This is a secondary tooth bud coming off to the side. That will eventually form the permanent tooth, but the initial tooth, the primary tooth, is going to form right here. So all of this is epithelial tissue here. This down below is dermal tissue or submucosal tissue. It's connective tissue down below. This all begins underneath here as a kind of mesenchyme, which is just a loose, very loose arrangement of cells that will eventually organize to form other structures of the tissue down underneath the epithelium. So far we have tooth bud forming here. This is going to be our enamel organ. And this is our secondary tooth bud. This connection to the overlying epithelium right here is sometimes referred to as a dental lamina. So next we need to look at a detailed view of what's going to be happening inside the enamel organ. That will be our next drawing. So here we are a little further along. Eventually this tooth will be pushed up as it grows. The bone will form around down here and the tooth will move up, and all of this material will be lost over the surface of the enamel. But for now, down in here as it develops, remember this is the gum line up here and this is epithelium. We had this structure grow down from the gum line to form a tooth bud and then the enamel organ. The enamel organ now consists of the outer enamel epithelium here, underneath of that, the stellate reticulum, then this intermediate zone right here, we call stratum intermedium, then we get to the layer that forms the tooth. And this first layer on the outside of the enamel, these cells are the enamel forming cells, the ameloblasts. Beneath that we have the enamel. Beneath the enamel in the blue here, and we have in there dentinal tubules. I'm going to put here dentin with dentinal tubules. Dentinal tubules are produced by the odontoblasts underneath here. They have fine processes, very much like bone cells had their little processes that go out through the canaliculi in bone. The processes that come from the odontoblasts out into the dentin are referred to as dentinal tubules. Or anyway, so the next layer here is going to be the odontoblasts. The dentin forming cells, odontoblasts. Inside of this, down inside here, this is originally referred to as a dental papilla. But eventually will become the pulp material. Sometimes we call it the pulp primordium. But anyway, the beginning of pulp will be there. It's initially the same kind of tissue that lies out around here, all of this connective tissue. So eventually this will grow down into the bone to form the mature tooth, and between the bone and the dentin layer we'll get cementum and the periodontal ligament to form that holds it in the bone. Now we've been talking about some of the materials that form the tooth, the enamel over the top of the tooth, the dentin beneath that, the cementum that's between the dentin and the periodontal ligament, and then beyond that we had the bone. All of the enamel, the dentin, the cementum, and the bone, all four of those are made up primarily, the hard material of those things, made up primarily of something we call hydroxyapatite. This is a large complex compound that includes calcium and phosphate groups. Large complex molecule includes calcium and phosphate groups. So if they're all made of the same thing, why don't we call them all the same thing? They are very different in the combinations of hydroxyapatite and other materials. Dentin, no, let's do enamel. Enamel, the book says, is about 96% hydroxyapatite. So this bone salt material, hydroxyapatite, is more pure in enamel than it is in dentin, cementum, or bone. So anyway, it forms a more crystalline-like arrangement, very uniform crystalline-like arrangement of the bone salts, the hydroxyapatite in there. Does not include any collagen. There's no collagen included in the enamel. Other kinds of organic materials. There are no cells, no blood vessels or anything in the enamel. And after the enamel is formed and it erupts from the gum line, we don't add any more enamel to our tooth. That's all the enamel we get, what's formed during that early developmental stage. Dentin, also made of hydroxyapatite, but it includes more organics. It includes collagen. and it includes those dentinal tubules. There are no cells and no blood vessels out in the dentin, just the hydroxyapatite, the dentinal tubules, and the collagen component there. Cementum. We have two different kinds of cementum really, but they're both made of the same thing. Part of it is more like a single layer of bone lamella without any canaliculi in it. So it's solid bone-like material, and part of it actually has cells in it. One layer of it has what we call cementocytes, which are very much like bone cells. Cementocytes, bone cells, there's hardly any difference between the two. There's no blood supply in the cementum, so we have a solid layer. It's like a solid lamella of bone without any of the processes in it, and then we have a layer with the cementocytes that do have like canaliculi, small processes that go out into the surrounding cementum in there. So when you think of these things, enamel, dentin, and cementum, think about how they compare to bone and how they compare to each other in terms of the constituent elements in there. So no collagen in enamel, we do have it in dentin and cementum. No cells in dentin, we do have it in some of the cementum. The dentin does have dentinal tubules that come from the odontoblasts. Dentin can continue to grow after the tooth erupts, and we can add more dentin tissue, or dentin material, I should say, to that layer there. So your dentin can thicken as you age, whereas we lose all the cells that produce enamel after the tooth erupts. All right, here we're looking at the junction between the bone and the tooth. Over here would be our pulp cavity. Then we have our layer of odontoblasts. Then we have our layer of dentin with the dentinal tubules. Dentin with tubules. Then in the green here is cementum. Then we have our periodontal ligament. And then bone out here. So the periodontal ligament that joins the tooth to the bone has fibroblasts and collagen. So it's mostly collagen. The fibers are arranged between the cementum. They attach to the cementum, embed on the cementum, and then reach over and attach to the bone. And fibroblasts maintain those and continually absorb and reestablish collagen fibers that link the tooth to the bone in the socket. So that's what's going on in your periodontal ligament. There are vessels and nerves also within that periodontal ligament region, but pretty tight connection with simply collagen fibers connecting the cementum to the bone in here. The pulp is mostly a loose connective tissue. Not a lot of collagen, but a fair amount of collagen though in there, and plenty of fibroblasts, lots of fibroblasts filling up that pulp space, loosely organized fibroblasts. And vessels and nerves are again an important part of your pulp cavity. You have the nourishment in here to supply all these odontoblasts, so they will be alive and maintain your dentin layer. The nerves are of course important. Some of the nerves from the pulp cavity follow between the odontoblasts and can invade into these dentinal tubules. So you have some sensitivity given to your tooth layer, your dentin layer here, from nerves that kind of extend out to that zone in your tooth.